For today's video, we'll be looking at The Resurrected, which, as I said last time, has been called the best serious Lovecraftian screen adaptation to date, which makes it sound like there's an even better one that's actually a comedy. And there have been quite a few movies to come out since this film, but it's still a pretty big claim. So let's see how it works out. Welcome back to HP Lovecraft Month. The Resurrected is based on the story The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which, as opposed to stories of cosmic monstrosities of epic scale, is the other kind of Lovecraftian story, science mixed with mysticism gone wrong. And having reviewed quite a few Lovecraftian movies of that style, it's going to need to be something quite unique to really stand out. We start with a bit of a problem, because some silly sod hasn't cranked the title into the correct place. Hold on. That's better. The film doesn't really give a great initial impression, showing a Bible quote that's neither mysterious nor poetic, or even that clever. Shall he live again? Well, the film's called The Resurrected, so yeah. In what's becoming quite the trend for these films, we once again begin in media res, at the stalwart of Lovecraft stories, an asylum. As one of the residents, a man named Charles Ward has escaped the facility.
How did he get out?
Looks like he went out the window.
Yeah, you might notice that Ward isn't the only thing that's escaped, as everyone's voices seem to have escaped as well, due to the horrendous dubbing that continues throughout the film, and I'm not too sure why. Ward's cell may be empty, but it's still freaking everyone out, and for good reason, as inside looks like a war zone, with one decapitated corpse, plenty of blood, and a huge scorch mark. Finding Ward's suitcase out the window, they suspect that's where he went, but it's far more complicated than that. Which we'll start to get answers for, as we move to the Street of Electrician Nightmares, and the office of Private Detective John March, who's looking pretty damn beaten up and admits his mental state is not too great either. Which is pretty much how all Lovecraft protagonists look after their story has put them through the ringer. March is going to fill us in on the whole story as he records the film's events for posterity. Which is when we flash back to 3 weeks ago, as we get a flyover of another Lovecraft staple, Providence, Rhode Island. This view is actually Hartford, Connecticut though, which is kind of an odd change, but hey, maybe they couldn't find flyover footage of Providence. March's story begins when he gets a new client, Claire Ward, the wife of Charles Dexter Ward, who she wants March to investigate, as he's isolated himself, but more alarmingly, he's been importing human remains from cemeteries. Which you have to admit is considerably more interesting than the usual run-of-the-mill, I think my husband is cheating on me cases private detectives usually get. And then, rather confusingly, this flashback gets its own flashback. It's pretty silly, and wouldn't be a problem if the film hadn't started in media res, cause it doesn't need to. It's a pretty good hook, yes, but if you just removed it, nothing would change. Claire's flashback is also unnecessary because it consists of her husband leaving a party suddenly to tend to his research. Ward is a scientist and chemical engineer, so it's not too far-fetched for him to have a laboratory. The creepy ethereal lights and late-night shouting that Claire says she witnessed, however, is strange for any kind of scientist, except maybe Dr. Frankenstein. But the worst part is that Ward works for Belmar Cosmetics. I never knew that hair conditioner needed the bending of reality to create. And what makes it funnier is that Belmar Cosmetics is a real company who make organic shampoo. Claire eventually throws Ward out of the house, and that's when we're introduced to the mysterious third party of Dr. Ash, who's working with Ward, And yes, he's wearing an obvious, ridiculous fake beard. Although I have to wonder if that's deliberate. To make it clear Ash is in disguise. But more on that later. Ward tells Claire that he's close to some kind of breakthrough. I assume a long-lasting mascara that's easy to wash out. Claire can even flash back to events where she wasn't even present, as the neighbour of Ward's new place called the cops on him for his constant late-night deliveries. And despite them finding more corpse-filled coffins, not much has been done, so it's unsurprising she's resorted to a PI. March agrees to have a look and investigate Ward's new place, to decide if he will take the case on. Also, March's secretary and his second-in-command are listening at the door, but why? It's not like he wouldn't discuss the case with them. Or are they wondering that March would jump an attractive woman in his office given the opportunity? It's a bit random. And honestly, that might be because Dan O'Bannon, the writer, put a lot of comedy moments in the film, which the studio later removed. Yeah, the film has kind of a troubled history, so we might have just seen remnants of that comedy there. Also, this could possibly be one of the few times I've actually agreed with studio intervention, because comedy in this film would just be weird as hell. Once Claire leaves, March is off to Ward's place and gets his second-in-command to look into him. Ward's home may be just outside Providence. However, the film makes it seem like a stereotypical horror movie rural community, as the first thing March comes across is a huge pool of blood and a surly mechanic, telling him it belongs to Wild Dog Roadkill. And to reinforce the horror movie stereotypes, the mechanic reluctantly tells March to find Ward's place, he can follow the stench of death to get there. The film's really racking up the cliches, which is doubly annoying because I started Lovecraft Month to try and get away from the traditional horror tropes. But I can guarantee that the film will start branching out a bit soon. Posing as a fire inspector, March has reached Ward's place, being greeted by his one-eyed henchman. Because if he wasn't suspicious, the addition of a quite imposing henchman really tips the scales. Ward answers the door and is, as expected, very evasive, not giving March any answers. So it's up to March's second-in-command to give him the info, as he's dug up, no pun intended, more about the human remains Ward was found with.
The cops found 8, count 'em, 8 boxes of human remains. Ward said it was all a shipping mistake.
This was apparently enough explanation for the cops. The guy also mentions that the bodies are linked to a large amount of European grave robbings, graves of wizards, magicians, and occult scholars. I'm not really sure how Ward managed to escape a police investigation. He's not even trying to hide his nefarious goings-on. He's clearly doing something illegal, or at least immoral. The problem is, no one seems to give a shit. The explanation given is that Ward is rich and connected to higher-ups, none of which we ever see any evidence of. But it is a quick and easy explanation. March shares what he has discovered with Claire, who now decides to tell him about a mysterious trunk Ward received, which is when all this madness began. It would have been a better bloody place to start her story, and not babbling about a party Ward skipped out on. Claire also mentions that Ward discovered in the trunk notes about an ancestor by the name of Joseph Kerwin, who was also some kind of magician, as Claire puts it. I should mention that I probably won't be talking much about how accurate the film is to the book, mainly because it's a pretty faithful adaptation. The only meaningful changes is that the film has been modernised and the main character is changed. In the novel, he's actually the Ward family doctor by the name of Marinus Bickwell Willett. So I can kind of understand why they changed that. Claire and Ward visit the place that Kerwin used, which is where Ward is now, not really finding much except for a piece of wallpaper badly attached to the wall, and upon peeling it, Ward finds a portrait of Kerwin, who rather strangely looks exactly like him. I know it's from the book, but they could have been a bit more clever here and made Kerwin look a bit different to Ward. Not so much that it's obvious, but just little subtle changes just so it's not so convenient. Claire takes March to Ward's first lab to investigate, and it's pretty empty now, with only drained blood bags and a few equations on the chalkboard. Also, there appears to be something close to the Elder sign on the board too. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar enough to imply mysticism. March also finds a copy of the Goya painting Saturn Devouring His Son, which will become very appropriate as we continue through. Later, while driving, March is told that the neighbour who called the cops on Ward tried to urgently contact him. However, when March tries to return the call, the line is disconnected, and arriving at the guy's place, March discovers why. The cops show him what remains of the neighbour, and it's not a pretty sight. But despite the guy looking like he just went 10 rounds with Pinhead, the cops are convinced it was wild animals that killed him. The cops are getting increasingly shit in this film. Back at the office, March suddenly feels he's being watched, but obviously nothing's there. And while March sleeps, he experiences a nightmare in a bizarre blue colour that I'm sure Sutter Kane would be proud of. March's experience at the door and his nightmare are actually quite important to note, because it wasn't Ward or Dr. Ash that was causing it. It was just the simple fact of what he witnessed is having a toll on him mentally. In Lovecraft, just the knowledge of these otherworldly things is dangerous and costly, as we'll see as the film continues. In the morning, March's second-in-command arrives with some big news.
Quit smoking.
Lonnie, that's wonderful. Good for you. God, your clothes aren't going to smell bad anymore and you're going to live longer. You've just done a wonderful thing for yourself.
This has been your random anti-smoking ad, brought to you by The Resurrected. Quit smoking, or Cthulhu will destroy you. Moving on from that randomness, Claire shows up with an answering machine tape of Ward, sounding very scared, telling his wife he's made a mistake, and to stay away from Dr. Ash, before getting cut off. So they both, quite logically, go back to Ward's place to investigate, once again getting the cold shoulder from his henchman, but March is insistent and Ward agrees to speak with them. However, Ward is looking even worse than he did before, and he has an incredibly raspy voice now, that Ward says is due to being ill. And it really shows how good Chris Sarandon is here, because, not to spoil anything, but he's no longer Ward, but pretending to be Ward.
Do not fret, my dear. There is no evil in what I do.
Okay, it's not the most convincing disguise, but it does take skill to switch characters halfway through a film, and Sarandon plays Kerwin very well, and he has this constant air of menace that you can't quite put your finger on. For now, anyway. March insists on getting some kind of answers from Ward, but he's not exactly crystal clear.
It is nothing less than the interrogation of matter.
Whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. So they both leave empty-handed. And in the car, Claire tells March she knows that was not Ward. So March theorizes her husband has taken on the personality of Kerwin. Or rather, he thinks he's crazy. So more investigation is needed. March gets interviews from Ward's neighbours and also looks into the large amount of meat and blood that keeps getting delivered to the house. And to complicate things, Ward's bank suspects his most recent checks are forgeries. Claire and March suspect Ward is crazy. So, rather surprisingly, in a rare move for a film, they actually do the most logical thing and get the police to send him to the nut house as they break into his place. The cops and March wander around for a bit, not finding much, but they thoughtfully let Claire wander around the place by herself, so she inevitably runs into Kerwin. At the same time, the cops get attacked by Ward's henchmen, managing to subdue him. However, as they take him outside, they find Claire and Kerwin waiting, the latter with a scalpel to the neck of the former. I guess so much for Kerwin's disguise? That went out the window pretty damn quickly. What happened to all his elaborate excuses? But then again, they were Ward's excuses, so maybe Kerwin's just not the improviser Ward was. Fortunately, March has the genius idea of getting slashed up. Well, it worked at least, so it wasn't the worst possible idea. And Kerwin gets a fancy new coat to keep him warm on his way to Bedlam. And in the hospital, Kerwin is pretty determined to not cooperate. But once he's calmed down a little, the doctors talk with him, and his main complaint is being unable to eat cooked meat. He needs raw meat and blood, telling the doctors that if he doesn't get it soon,
It will be a damnable mess.
that subtle, unable to pinpoint menace has graduated to Kerwin being very obviously menacing and a dangerous individual. He claims he doesn't have much control of his actions, but he also doesn't seem to care much either. which takes us back to his terrible excuses, because he tells March that he's made a mistake and he's a good guy. But when the doctor talking to Claire tells her that he has obsessions with blood, with both homicidal and cannibalistic tendencies, the cat is well and truly out of the bag. And the flesh sucked off its bones knowing Kerwin. That night, March has a spark of inspiration and decides to check out Kerwin's trunk again, surprising Claire by practically breaking in. And inspecting its contents, March cuts open the fabric side and finds a load of hidden documents. How did he know to do that? And more importantly, how did he manage to find those letters on his very first try? Let's be honest.
That's convenient.
It should have taken him at least a few tries, come on. Especially since he doesn't know what or why he's looking for anything. Anyway, onto the contents of the documents, specifically the diary of Ezra Ward, leading into another flashback, this time to 1771. And according to the diary, Kerwin stole Ezra Ward's girl. But it's the 1700s, so by stole, they mean given to him by her father for money. But while Kerwin's away, his wife Eliza and Ezra play. This is when she tells Ezra about her husband's petty dabbling in the dark arts, as we get another flashback within a flashback. She recalls Kerwin emerging from his lab sporting a nasty wound, violently stopping his wife from getting a doctor because...
Just to be expected. The dead take much blood.
Okay, but that doesn't really solve the gaping arm wound, or explain why a doctor shouldn't tend to it. Again, Kerwin is shit at giving excuses. After some more digging, much like March, Ezra figures Kerwin is up to no good, and he's discovered that the building has a hidden tunnel to the river. So Ezra and a load of soldiers camp it out waiting for Kerwin. However, while they do, something is spotted floating down the river. And after dragging it ashore, they discover an eldritch abomination that's still very much alive. And holy crap, the effects for it are incredibly well done. Kind of reminds me of The Thing, and the effect works really well in very much the same way. The creature is eldritch and hideous, so its unrealistic look adds to the unsettling atmosphere. And as is the way at the time, the creature is subsequently burned, and then the men assault Kerwin's house, who they seem to be going to war with in quite an overkill fashion. Meanwhile, Eliza reveals that she's pregnant with Kerwin's child, meaning that Kerwin, not Ezra Ward, is Charles Ward's ancestor. And rather disappointingly, that's where the story ends. Talk about a cliffhanger. Later on the news, it seems they got to Kerwin too late, as another one of his neighbours have been brutally slain. But also his henchman is now dead, both looking like a wild animal has been at them. But would the police let a news crew film that close to a dead body? I mean, okay, it's under a blanket, but that's still a lot of blood for a news programme. But then again, whatever these cops do doesn't really surprise me. Claire says it's time they called the police. However, they decide on the much more sensible idea of blowing the holy hell out of Kerwin's house instead. Their justification being that, hey, Claire owns the place. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure you can't go around exploding buildings just because you own it. March and his second-in-command soon have the large amount of plastic explosives they need, because those are the things that are very easily to get a hold of, apparently. Oh, and that anti-smoking message didn't seem to be very effective. Also, if that guy dies, this film is definitely trying to make some kind of anti-smoking statement. And while driving, March has another sanity-bending moment. Again, there's no reason for March to see Kerwin in his ash disguise. It's incredibly random and nonsensical. But that's exactly why I like it so much. It just emphasises how much everything is affecting March. And it shows that it's not just simply death they have to worry about. Meeting up with Claire, it's time to visit the Kerwin house for hopefully the last time. And I must admit, they're surprisingly well prepared, with a pistol and shotgun. It doesn't take them long to find the entrance to Kerwin's lair, which looks like the kind of hatch to give Lost a run for its money. And the stench of death coming from it doesn't bode well. They find an old and dangerous underground complex beneath the house. Wow, even the film was trying to help that jump scare. It'll take more than just audio stings to make dust scary, I think. They eventually reach one of Kerwin's experiment rooms filled with books, including his diary, and if I'm honest, it's a bit contrived because the book tells March exactly how everything works and how to stop it. It's basically an how to end this movie 101. It first describes Kerwin managing to cheat death and finding the key to resurrection. However, it also says that any flesh taken, as in eaten, might have a tendency to return from where it came from. So a pretty big downside there, one might say. And once again, I'm surprised this film contains characters who make clever decisions, because they all think the diary is pretty unbelievable, so when March finds the life-giving elixir, he's like, fine, let's find out for ourselves. They find the wall is covered with urns filled with people's ashes, specifically wizards and occultists, including
Nicholas Flamel.
Yes, because Nicholas Flamel is not just an ancillary Harry Potter character. He was actually a French scribe who died in 1418. But for some reason, after his death, the myth arose that he discovered the Philosopher's Stone, which supposedly turned base metals into gold, but more importantly for this film, he also achieved immortality through his elixir of life. Which, in the film's world, that's all true. But still no reason to respect his remains, as March just grabs a handful and chucks it about a bit. Then, to add insult to injury, he tries out the elixir on a random piece of flesh that's still on the table, mixed with Flamel's ashes, creating a living mound of writhing flesh. And once again, the effects, a combination of puppetry and stop motion, is very well done, which is enough to convince the three of Kerwin's discovery. Continuing through the tunnels, they find a room containing bones and holes in the floor, and looking in the holes, we witness the extent of Kerwin's research, which is another mass of living flesh. However, there's worse than that down there, as they find a homunculus gnawing on a head. And due to them not bringing a decent bloody torch, the lantern is dropped, and the film gets almost seizure-inducing in how it flickers the light. But anyway, March's second-in-command falls into one of the holes, and because of these creatures' voracious appetites, he's subsequently torn apart and eaten. Called it?
March and Claire run around with the monster for a bit, and despite March shooting it several times, the gun doesn't have much effect. The monster is only stopped when March kicks it into another hole. And just before leaving, Claire takes a suitcase belonging to Ward, which will be another very convenient find, and I'll talk about it soon. They make their way out, March placing the explosives about the place, and then once far enough away, the house is detonated in a pretty impressive explosion, with zero explanation how they didn't get arrested for that.
Also, this isn't very important, but it seems very weird to me that the film took its time to show us that Kerwin had a secret tunnel leading to an escape door when it's never used or has any impact on the plot. Seems pretty pointless to me.
Back at the office, March looks through Ward's suitcase, finding Dr. Ash's disguise, and also a lot of human bones, which at this point, it's pretty obvious they're Ward's bones. See, I told you it was a convenient find. So now that March has all the information he's gonna need, he decides to visit Kerwin in the asylum to try and get the entire story from the horse's cannibalistic mouth. Also, this asylum seems to have really shit security.
Thanks, Dave. I'll call you if I need you.
I won't hear you. You'll have to hit this button.
Yeah, because why would they want to be able to hear patients in distress? Also, no way would they just abandon a patient who clearly can't do anything for themselves due to the straitjacket alone. But I guess considering the state of mental health facilities in the Lovecraft universe, this is pretty much par for the course. He should be happy that rats aren't eating his toes, frankly.
And perhaps one of the most surprising parts of the film, Kerwin actually tries to pretend to be Ward again, despite all that's happened, which is pretty laughable. Fortunately, March is having none of it and calls him out on his bullshit. Because after he informs Kerwin his place has been blown to smithereens, he once again drops the act pretty quickly.
I blew it up. Afraid so. I blew the shit out of it.
Also, I do enjoy March's smugness. And after March dumps Ward's bones on the floor, it's time for Kerwin to act smug when telling March how he came back to life, as we see another flashback, this time of Ward resurrecting Kerwin. And I know I keep talking about the effects, but they're really incredible here. Similar in some ways to the resurrection scene in Hellraiser, as Kerwin slowly becomes whole. But hey, at least he gets to keep his skin.
Although, come to think of it, both Kerwin and Frank are brought back to life, and both require blood to become whole. Interesting. And eventually Kerwin just stabs up Ward. And after that, March hears about Kerwin's rather exuberant god complex, as he talks about the things he can now do, like...
I have drawn down demons from the stars.
Which perhaps is a reference to some of the more exotic creatures of Lovecraft.
Time and cosmos belong to me. The destinies of all things, living and dead, are mine.
Yeah, he says all this, but there's really no evidence to suggest he can actually do any of the crap that he says. Most people would just be satisfied with immortality. After explaining everything to March, Kerwin once again does his party trick of saying fuck it and goes mental. First by breaking out of his straitjacket. Seems he really was committed to the whole fake crazy thing then. March calls for help, but he's really not much use, as Kerwin punches him across the room and then tears his head off. Kerwin also theorizes that because he's considered mad, he'd receive no punishment from the murder of the orderly and March. I'm really not sure that's how it works. You can't just casually tear a head off here, eat a few people there, and expect to be home in time for tea. If that were the case, Hannibal Lecter would have had a lot more fun. Kerwin chews on March a bit, but he still has the elixir bottle. Kerwin remains confident, however, that's when March throws the bottle at Ward's bones, which quickly animate, resulting in a fight. And as the book says, Kerwin's skin is literally torn from his bones, partially reconstructing Ward, before they both die in a sparkly explosion. And the room now looks like it did at the start of the film, so March throws Ward's case out of the window, which makes it look like Ward escaped. And that's where the film ends. Once again, a film not outstaying its welcome. I like that. And yeah, that was The Resurrected. And honestly, it's pretty damn good. And it's quite frankly annoying that it hasn't got the notoriety that it deserves. First of all, because I haven't mentioned it enough, the special effects are incredible for this film. From the eldritch resurrection effects and the gory puppets, everything is so well done. Chris Sarandon is a real standout for this film, actually managing to take an admittedly goofy character and making him both very compelling and intimidating. And finally, this is one of the more accurate adaptations of a Lovecraft story, and I don't really have anything bad to say about it. I must admit, I didn't really know how this film would go. What with it adapting a not particularly well-known Lovecraft story, and also Prince Humperdinck as the villain. But I was very pleasantly surprised. And next time for HP Lovecraft Month, we have a first. The first sequel to a previous review. So once again, I'm going to be a bit apprehensive. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.